A special advisor to Tony Blair, MP, Secretary of State, and a minister. Good afternoon. So Bigton is all yours. So we haven't had to fight, but I played soccer yesterday. That's why I'm a bit limp. I'm going to speak English, if I may. Not limp, but I've a Band-Aid on my forehead. So this study, that will be my first part of my presentation. I'll explain how, when I was the Minister of Culture in the UK, what we did in the digital field. Short video first.
We are two of the three creators of the online video series Beached As.
Bro, you're heaps beached, eh? So beached. Beached is. What a chip, bro.
We saw YouTube as a platform that we could improve our filmmaking on, we could get exposure, we could get, even more importantly, I suppose, feedback from people.
If you look at the blogs on YouTube, there are hundreds and thousands of Australians all over the world kind of celebrating their Australianness as a result of the Ship Song project. And we never knew that we were kind of creating almost a tourism campaign for Australia. What I love about online is the fact that it's really proactive. It's a really proactive medium. So it's not a sit back, it's a sit forward media. People seek out what they want, and therefore I think they're much more deeply immersed in the content. I love that. I love the whole democratization of content on the internet.
I prefer watching things online because it's on demand.
You can interact with it at your own pace. You can take longer to read something, or you can watch a video when it suits you.
My favourite thing to watch online is basically music videos.
I do a lot of viewing of like TED.
I'm kind of learning guitar, so I'll go in there and I'll just look up tabs.
Skateboarding websites always have little video clips.
Spoofs on things that my friends may have done.
People all over the world watched it because it's predominantly Australian artists. We thought mostly Australians will consume it, but actually we found people all over the world loved it.
After about a month, Beached As was getting 10,000 hits, 20,000 hits, 50,000 hits, and yeah, we hadn't ever seen anything we'd ever done do that. It's just given us the opportunity to continue doing what we love doing and make money out of this industry and just be creative non-stop. So, yeah, opportunity.
So this was a study we did in Australia, and I guess the two, which we did with Google, and the two main conclusions were, first of all, that it was a false choice between online content and offline content, that as people had been using more and more online content, actually their use of traditional media, like TV or radio, had gone up as well. So actually, rather than it being a sort of a fixed cake, the cake was actually growing. And I guess the second thing which the video in particular illustrated was that quite a lot of content creators had found that the internet was a fantastic way to A, find new audiences, but also to get around traditional gatekeepers who had stood between them and their audiences in Australia, but also their audiences all around the world. So we've asked ourselves whether the same would be true in Europe, and we're just at the start of doing the same study, not just for France, but for the whole continent. And we have some early results, which I'd like to share with you today. So when I was at school in France, we always used to like comparing what was best about France and what was best about Britain, who was better, Michel Platini or Kevin Keegan. And so this study gives us a chance to do a little bit of that as well. Because one of the things that we do in the study is to ask people how much they value different types of activities from their daily life. So how much they value the internet, but also how much they value things like drinking coffee or taking a shower, or eating chocolate. And then we say to them, well, which would you be prepared to give up for a year? So would you prefer to give up using the internet for a year, or would you prefer to give up eating chocolate for a year? And what comes out of this study is actually the internet has now become one of the most important things that people rely on. So actually, if you ask French people whether they would rather have the internet or chocolate, coffee, and alcohol, quite important parts of French life, I hope you'll agree, 2/3 of people say they would rather give up coffee, chocolate, and alcohol than give up the internet. When you ask them if they'd rather give up having a shower for a year or having sex for a year, 5% of French people say they would give up having a shower for a year, and 15% of French people say that they would give up having sex for a year. There may be a little bit of overlap between those two groups. Maybe that if you go for the first one, then the second one happens to you automatically. To reassure you, the figures for Britain are that 17% of British people would give up having a shower for a year, 17%, and 25% would give up having sex for a year, rather than lose the internet. So at least France isn't quite as bad as we are. We then asked people how much they would, we use that to compare the financial value that means. So in effect, by knowing how much people would give up the internet or give up other things, and then asking them how much they spend on those other things, you can quantify how much people are getting extra from the internet compared to what they're paying for it. So what we call the consumer surplus. The internet has made it much easier to get information for free, information that before would have been stored in libraries or in bookshops. And the number that comes out is 3,500 euros per year. So in effect, French consumers are getting free content from the internet worth 3,500 euros a year, which, compared to the average salary, is quite a significant number. Some of that will be piracy, but actually a lot of it will be legitimate. So, we would argue that the internet is providing quite a big consumer surplus for people in France and in lots of other countries as well. Actually, slightly higher in France than in the UK. And when I was at school here, I remember coming up to the Centre Pompidou and seeing what was then this very advanced technical approach of microfiche and being able to sort of see all the amazing content that you could get there. Now, if people said that all the content that you could get on the internet would be what was available then in the Centre Pompidou, people would go crazy. There would be a revolution. So we do think that the internet has massively democratized culture. And when I was a minister, we thought about what we wanted to do about that, because we wanted to protect and support British culture just as much as anybody else did. And the big thing that we thought the internet meant was that now sort of negative measures, trying to stop things from happening, were going to be pretty hard to do. So instead, we started trying to do what we call positive measures of investing and supporting. So we tried to bring our culture budget into closer alignment with the French one. So we tripled the amount we spent on culture. We increased the license fee, the redevance, for the BBC by nearly 50%. We also did something very un-British, and we created a Ministry for Culture. Until then, we had called it the Ministry for Heritage. But one other thing we did, which I think is quite important and interesting to learn from, is we believe that there is a virtuous circle between consumers and producers. We thought that the more adventurous, the more numerous consumers you had, the greater the market the producers would be able to sell into. So you needed both lots and lots of consumers, but you also wanted them to be adventurous. And that's why from the start we had a very proactive strategy trying to get more and more people to use the internet. And BCG did another study recently, and this is the point on which I'll finish, which looked at the leading internet economies around the world. And what's very striking about those leaders, who are Sweden, well, in order, South Korea, Iceland, Sweden, Denmark, and the UK, is that A, they don't include the United States, and B, that every one of those countries has had a very proactive strategy from the start. So they have had a state. They haven't believed that it's just all about the market, that the internet should just be left to business and consumers. They've had a very proactive strategy to make sure that there is universal access, but they've combined that with a market-friendly approach. And I suppose that's the approach that we wanted to take. One of saying, yes, we want to invest in culture, but we want to do it by having positive measures rather than negative ones. And I guess that's what the final thought I would leave you with. So, merci.
Absolument, vous restez avec nous, Jeanne PURNELL. Merci.
Yeah, please stay with us. Thank you. First of all, internet is a drug, just like any other drug, and that soccer or football is a combat sport as much as the digitization of culture. Time to welcome our other guest, Bertrand PECQUERIE, who is the director of the Global Editors Network. How has the press been able to reinvent its mode of operating, and who benefits from the crime? Bertrand. Then we have Noël, who is the general manager of SACEM. He studied ESSEC at Sciences Po and played a part in the creation of LICAM, and then Canal+, where he spent some time, and he has a long experience in this field. So you supported the launch of a 3G at Orange. So your guru of copyrights, Edmund Quilty is his name, copyright and IP enforcement director. The IP Intellectual Property Office in the UK, Edmund Quilty. New representative of British corners. So all our guests are here on stage with us. Let's take a concrete example of what's happening. If I tell you mega box, who am I hinting at? FBI, the majors, or you're aware that this is the new project by Kingdom Come since its custody, and with a new business model, which is much more interesting both for artists and the claimants. Or there was a huge buzz. Now we're not sure that the launch will actually take place. There might be some bluff there, but the buzz is huge. So please, could you react to this new business model? Bertrand PECQUERIE first. As you're trying to discover the new model, what does it tell you? What about this attempt, this project? Well, more and more for creators. This is very much the trend in open source, and free software. That's what it's all about. That is going to become the prevailing trend, I'm sure. You introduced me as someone, a member of the press. Indeed, I'm a member of the World Association of Editors, and when it comes to content management system, these systems wouldn't be a system that were actually owned. With ADOS, CCIDT, large system, big system, you'd be hundreds of thousands of dollars for them. And then you get free softwares, open software, so that any media can manage thousands of billions of contents. So this is what open source is all about. So it's a definite trend towards decriminalization. I think it's going to prevail, and prevail by far. We're just at the very beginning of this new trend. So huge percentages being paid to platforms. This is something which will no longer be the case. It seems that only one industry is resisting the business model, that is culture. What have you done? Have you decided that you will stand up and resist? No, I'm not comparing with our business, our industry, with the industry that do nothing but provide bandwidth. Think in terms of aeronautics, automotive industry, or food processing. Cultural industries are among those that have been most successful at digital revolution. I would say that all cinema halls are digitized. You can find or read magazine online. No one would ever make traditional records or cassettes or tapes. It's all fully digital. So the real question is this: where can we possibly create value? Where can we expect to get revenues from to generate growth and jobs on our continent. So contents as opposed to pipe work. That's for the past 15 years. We see clearly there is a relationship, a cooperation very often, but also a competition. Creative industries, telecom and internet industries are generating more revenues than the others. Now, how could internet benefit from culture? Some actors, and Kingdom is a very good example of this, are like parasites. They've set out their own businesses. They feed into other businesses. Would we have a broadband had there been so much intellectual content to download? Would people subscribe to a DSL in order to pay their taxes and check their emails? No, of course you can't. You don't need a broadband for that. But not web servers are not hackers or pirates. No, they're just like any other citizen. They use webs because there's a huge potential. I'm referring to the huge revolution, cultural revolution that started a few years ago. I'm referring to the user-generated content, that the way in which you can disseminate information by your own means, in your own way. And the actors of creation were the first actors of the web from that perspective. Here you're referring to a number of actors that made lots of money unlawfully, and then decided they would call the freedom of the web to the rescue to justify their doings. So what about value creation? I can see where the value creation is in our continent, in our country. Cultural industries, Terra study, 14 to 15 million jobs in the European Union. Cinema, music, the visual design, advertising, 14 to 15,000 jobs. The internet or telecom industry, I come from there. So it breaks my heart, but on our continent, unfortunately, these two industries are the thing of the past. So we need to create value. What can we do in the field of culture? Edmund Quiddy, how do you feel about this very interesting trend? We know that the UK has a very different type of relationship with the copyrights at this institution. How do you see these changes in the business model? I think it's interesting what you are saying. Begin in England. A survey was published recently saying that the value of the internet in the UK is around 90,000 billion pound sterlings, but the value of cultural industry is 3.2 billion. So you see, there's a lot of value which is not actually based on cultural industry, and which is captured by the internet. So you need to be aware, to remain aware of the fact that the protection of culture, you have to take these two facts into account. The other uses of the internet come into play, and many uses will be generated in the future. We're not even aware of these new usages. So the point is, when? What about regulating? Because things are changing all the time and at a very fast pace. So how can you possibly regulate?
Right, in the UK. Could you just come back to this story? Because it was quite a match, actually.
Sorry?
It was quite, like a combat. People really had to struggle, and you had to struggle as a UK government member to implement the new copyright law in the UK.
Yeah. Well, je crois que nous avons.
The cultural industry and consumers. Now we have new stakeholders, new players, Amazon, that are part of this debate. But I think that the debate we're having in the UK is very much polarized. One tends to adopt very strong positions without any sense of collaboration. There's no give and take attitude there. I'm being struck by the fact that in many industries, I don't know the CEO, but I know those who are lobbying, and the lobbying play the most important part, I would say. And this is the same everywhere. But I think it's difficult to carry out a change, to implement changes of policies in this field, and this is the situation we're in. If I'd like to make a comment, maybe because I come from the two worlds, I can't see any opposition. But beyond that, I can see coordination, cooperation. If you see, what is Google making benefits out of? Well, the very successful algorithm initially. Why is it that there is a clash between Samsung and Apple? Well, it's intellectual property, basically. That's where the value lies. I do not believe in the figures you quoted. Look at the French market. The UK market in terms of music is more developed than the French one. The global market, cultural and creative industries, as per the definition of the European Commission, represents 7% of the French GDP, 150 billion in terms of value, and thousands of jobs. Then there are a telecom and IT industry, which altogether, if you rely on the figures provided to us by operators, service operators, so altogether 10,000 jobs at most in terms of value creation. I think we're mixing two things. Now, the digital media are supposed to contribute something to economy, maybe in agriculture, the financial industry, and this applies to all activities in the countries. But in the field of, in the sectors, when you call it sectors, the one that works and operates thanks to copyrights, it's only one sector. It's the same everywhere, so that video games or Google or iTunes people are all in the same boat as our cultural industries. Let me give you one last example. Last week, the SACEM, a number of our European partners and Universal Music Publishing, we are launching the first hub in Europe. One of the leading actors in the digital sector to use it with Google, and we've signed an agreement for the representation of our repertoires with them. So we are very much talking cooperation there rather than a opposition, sterile opposition. Bertrand, PECQUERIE, you're using these new models on a daily basis because you have 400 editors from 80 countries worldwide. How do you work? How do you operate? What about the value creation of value? How do you generate value? It's based on the concept of democratization. I'm not talking in terms of international perspective, but a French dream, culture for all, education for all. And what do we see? Well, Malraux created a Maison de la Culture, cultural centers, and who is materializing the dream? Larry Page, Steve Jobs, and Zuckerberg. They are giving flesh to this dream. Culture for all has become something real, tangible, not talking in terms of relation, distribution, or business model. To me, this debate is based on the concept of dream and creativity. Here again, when we discuss culture, there will be no Picasso or no Raphael in the internet. What's going to happen, though, we'll have a group of artists, the services that will make the bars in 20, 30 years from now is not going to be one individual, someone who makes an happening. Perhaps Dali was the last one to organize happenings. But you'll see creations, collective types of creation, not just user-generated content, but collective group creation. Perhaps, same thing as they had at the Renaissance time with these studios, artists, something which belongs to the past, but it's totally new at the same time. So creativity is something which is very much a collective adventure. It's not an individual enterprise, and it's a very strong break from the world of culture that we had in 20th century. I fully agree with you, but still, how can you pay creators? I think we would agree with the need to pay creators in the UK. But perhaps in our country, we're perhaps more despair. I mean, we don't believe in the old ways of making all things pay. So we need to organize other ways to support artists and creation, well, the BBC, museums, and so forth. And then finding new models. I think it's fascinating what happens in Australia with music. Art in Australia, I mean, it's going up. The amounts of money invested in the music industry is going up. Perhaps we need to improve on the distribution between Apple, Google, Amazon, but things are going up. So perhaps we think that it would be nice to keep the old ways of paying creators, but it's not possible. Perhaps you could share the burden with the public sector and find new ways to pay for creation. Now, are you discussing jobs essentially? Or are you interested in consumption? Maybe in the future, we're not going to have to pay creators that much because the way in which culture is being disseminated is more effective than it was in the past. It's an open question, I don't know. Well, the trend in France, the global amount of money which is distributed to copyright holders, how does it look like in terms of trend? For SACEM, revenues are going down like everywhere else in the world. So you haven't seen this upward trend, not yet, because what James is referring to is an upwards trend in terms of volume from the digital industry. Same thing is happening in France. When it comes to streaming, France is the second country after Sweden in Europe. But this upward trend will stop at about half of what it was a few years ago. So it's something to do with the business model here. I very much agree with what Bertrand said, but I would go one step further. There's always been group creation, like there was individual creation. Who composed the Gregorian chants? And nobody. There were monks chanting. So in the 21st century, as was said beautifully by the Council of Europe on Cyberculture, 1995. That's where they invented the word collective intelligence. It's very topical. But be it collective or individual, there will have to be creation by creators who want to make a living out of their creation. SACEM, the second copyright industry in the world, company in the world, 4,500 people decided they would make a living out of the music in this country. Nobody can tell who will be the David Guetta of France in a few years from now. Unless you enable these people to hope that they'll make a living out of their creation, this is for sure. Then there won't be any creation anymore. There won't be European creation anymore. Maybe there will be some creation on other markets that have a natural advantage or with high degree of protection, like the Indian market for the audiovisual industry. So the point about the financing, we always had three models for the funding, financing of creation. This has been given for the past centuries. You had public monies invested in creation is always being there. Then private money, the individual sponsor, look at music, producer of entertainment or records, and then you have a collective model, which is collective model. It's very much a trade union position. The agreement we negotiated with Google for repertoire was better in terms of outcome, as if each one of our members had to sign an individual agreement with Google. That's life. It's not going to change. And let me add this. In our world, which is highly fragmented in terms of means of payment, highly fragmented, devices are different. Collective management is probably the best possible system. Spotify for SACEM, billions of information streamed to be distributed over millions of works. If you were to convert this on paper, you would have 38 semi-trailers. So say this type of collective management is very effective. In order to pay for creation, to remunerate commission, how do you share the value? You can't escape that issue. Some leading actors in the IT and telecom industry, Apple, will distribute more than $30 billion to its shareholders. Who are the income holder? You hand over so much money to shareholders instead of investing in innovation, which means that you are living in industry that doesn't have to make any money. It lives out at its own revenues, its own income. The income it generates itself. And our members have lost 1/4 of revenue since 2003. So our problem is how can we rebalance the value creation, if you want the word of creation to be able to benefit to the actors of the internet rather than the other way around. Bertrand, PECQUERIE, probably you have some kind of philosophical agreement from all of us on this point, but why is it that they stick to the genes, if I may say? Well, we are in a very bad, awkward position if we take up your reasoning, because it's a zero-sum game, as if you were supposed to preserve a capital. I mean, the SACEM of the 60s, and you can't think of anything else. It's a blocked horizon, so you have to recover this. Let me go back to your example. The Guardian. I mean, typically British newspaper. And now it's become a global title. 1/3 of British readers, 1/3 in the US, 1/3 rest of the world, and 1/3 in the UK. They've lost 30,000 British sterling per year. So I'm not going to say that it's a financially sustainable model. But the newspaper has become a global public, and same thing with the Daily Mail. Now, the difference between the first leading titles in French press and the leading titles were 1 to 2 10 years ago. Now it's 1 to 5. So one shouldn't reason in terms of, are you referring to the circulation or revenues? Yeah, circulation, of course. What about competition? You could bake a bigger cake and still there will be competition. Yeah, in terms of distribution, of course. Competition is one thing, distribution. So let's think of a bigger cake. In other words, the French artists shouldn't think that they are operating in a French market, but they're operating on a global market. What about the standard bearers of the French touch? Daft Punk, Cassav, 120,000 people on a stadium in Angola. Who's exporting things in the most ambitious way? Who is exporting French creation and French touch? Well, you know, people who sing, interpret. You know, French culture exports very well. I have a problem with the line of reasoning. For how long are the shareholders of The Guardian accept to lose so much money per year? That's the problem, because there is an internet revolution going on which is unstoppable. I'm referring to universal democratization and access to larger dissemination. So the 21st century will be built on this basis. Now, this concerns 1/4 of the planet, but that's one of the best and most beautiful revolution. Each one of us can become a creator, an actor on that stage. Still, a number of creators have an audience. They want to reach out to their audience and want to make a living out of their creation. They're totally entitled to do this. Models are changing. The printed press, you know, Antoine Gallimard was very much in the news after the summer, referring to the electronic book, but also the kind of a piracy that would wreak havoc, the electronic book. So sharing value, of course, I don't mind being seen as a bad guy, but we have an issue. I mean, diffusion, number of creators at the SACEM. SACEM is a syndicate that represents their members to give value to their repertoire. Number of members of SACEM has doubled within a few years. And the French repertoire is the second worldwide after the Anglo-Saxon repertoire. So there is a sign of vitality. In your field, that's the printed press, there indeed we can be concerned. Well, I was working at Matignon, dealing with internet. The printed press people would say that we're afraid of the internet, and some of them, the boldest of them, told us that the advertising financing model will help them grow. 10 years down the road, it's not the situation. Advertising doesn't pay anymore. Or not enough to enable the printed press to grow. And we are Democrats. We think we need a press. So this is a real issue. I don't have the answer, but perhaps let's ask the real questions. So perhaps we've been living on the idea there was a problem with the tool rather than a crisis with the content. Is it not? And this is not why the printed press industry is dying. So I'm referring to the new models or changing models. Is it not the crux of the matter, this dichotomy between the tool and content?
C'est vous, hein? Après, ce sera Edmond.
Là, je voudrais pas être trop franco-français, mais
no, this is not a Franco-French thing. It's a question of offer on the French side. It's not a crisis as to who requires what. Editors say, well, French people are no longer reading, or they read on a tablet. I mean, it's very sad for the effort, because on the British side, and in Germany also, you have 2 or 3 times more daily local newspaper than in France. In the UK, you have 3 times more national daily papers than in France. Obviously, it's a crisis on the offer side here. You know, there was a Malthusianic type of attitude from the French press, but that's for the French side. But you've always lost money. And with us also, Guardian lost money. Guardian, you know, the rich man playing with money, funded for a long time by a car magazine, you see? Noël is right here. For The Guardian, we had here a race between the possibility to become global, really global, be much larger with low revenue, or maybe the option would be to take money from Gates, maybe, and it's going to become like university. Gates, you mean the Gates Foundation? That's a very tiny thing, isn't it? Yes, but the Los Angeles Times is taking money from the Gates Foundation because it is the way to see that money comes from the consumer, like the academic sector. So they just come to apply to knowledge. By the way, discussing Guardian. That's on the shareholder side. But is digitalization responsible for the deficit of The Guardian? They lost money before anyway. Are they losing more money now? Are they playing the card of digital? But the car magazine was highly profitable, and then the internet killed this. So they lost this, they lost the original press content. They can't use the money of one to hide the loss in the other. In support of what has Jen B said. By James, indeed, for 10th and 10th of years, we had a model in which the flagship was the larger type of daily paper. They were funded by Milk Cow, the tiny press with ads, and all this collapsed, or this model collapsed. We saw it for a number of French press groups. I don't want to just to challenge these newspapers, but the question of funding creation. Well, for what is not, in fact, individual, but the collective creation, it is there and it will come back. But the question is still there, but I'd like to ask my British friend, what strikes me is that we have models, such as the one of the private levy. A model that we apply in France, but in fact invented in Germany. This is a discussion that is being dealt with at at, in fact, the European level, but I mean, there are a number of obstacles because digital will be the future and the rest will be nothing. But for growth and employment is not the future, in fact, because our IT industry is good, but it's produced in Asia and innovated in the States, which is good for these two continents and not too good for us. Anyway, so private levy is a freedom for the consumer to whom an exception has been brought. Copyright, which is the freedom to authorize a copy of your work, is sort of an expropriation of the author from that right, but the consumer pays for it? Yes, but consumers, wait, they can copy, and there is a remuneration against this copyright. When we look at the very last Apple product, you know, the same product is more costly in Paris than in the States. And we have a private levy in Paris, and we don't have it in other countries, just the UK or the UK. The device, you know, the tablets has increased price in some countries, not in others. So you see, consumers, they have to bear the price of everything. Because in some countries, there's no such private levy. People forget that then you cannot just copy, you're banned from copies. If I try to myself take the latest, you know, records within my PC, then from the PC on my iPhone, I have two private copies here, two private levy. In continental Europe, I can do it, and creation is paid by the manufacturers. In the UK, I have violated the law twice, and that's a paradoxical element here. There are regulatory provisions from the law invented for the last 25 years, which do not prevent an explosion of digital usage, fabulous growth of profits and margins of those companies that produce the devices. And opposing this, there is a system whereby you can have creation funded. That's rather healthy. And this is the model that we try to kill, one way or another. This is counterproductive. And to go back to the roundtable session topic, make culture benefit from the internet, knowing, by the way, that internet and industry really need to have a creative culture. Bertrand and Edmund, who would like to start? Collective intelligence was discussed here. Collective intelligence. What about intelligence, artificial intelligence, i.e., when it comes to cultural production, when it comes to press production, which is what I know better? What you have are robot news. Do you know robot news? You create, like in Google, algorithm for information distribution. We can have algorithms set up for information production, whether it's a football, baseball match, financial news, or a political party crisis like we have here. An algorithm for the crisis of our political parties? Well, maybe we could solve the problem. I mean, it can produce automated content with no human hand on it. I mean, it makes me cry. Where are the journalists? You have robots creating the information, identifying them. If you discuss the Marseille football team, you will have the terms used by the Marseille football. All this is automated. And this is what, in the 10 years to come? It's going to be controlled. AFP is going to shut. What about Bloomberg and others? They already do it. They already do it. Before they had outsourcing, if you remember, a lot of people like Bloomberg are working from India, and then AFP works in Morocco. So they had outsourcing. But the next generation will be robots, artificial intelligence. And from the cultural point of view, it's going to be hard to find the owners of those rights. So the next DG will be a robot, you think? Well, it all started in the 50s, and we had random music, I remember. I myself started programming the basic language, and I remember programming random music with my computer years and years ago. No, artificial intelligence, indeed, In extreme cases as the one, well, then maybe things will be better with artificial intelligence. But anyway, more than ever, there will remain one thing which is unpredictable, even by the most powerful computer, and that's what you call talent, creation. And this is why we live in high-risk industries. And we look at the music business models, nobody can anticipate, in fact, what the next hit is going to be. And the next hit means people, artists, creators. As to the written work, books, we've been having novels for years and years, were difficult to read, produced by artificial intelligence. So sorry about this, but I mean, this is another topic. Very interesting, but I believe it's another roundtable session. I don't want to play George Orwell myself. Edmund, what I find interesting with you is that you have your vision of the copyright evolution, which is very much technology-oriented.
The fact that you're just saying that copyrights need to move as fast as technology does.
In technology? Well, as to private copy, consumers pay for that for the device, which does not reflect the content usage. Is this a levy, a real levy? Maybe we need that levy to pay for the artist. I know some surveys said that it's not such a high or a major percentage of sales from authors. So it gives money to the artists, you see. There's a way to pay them. I believe that the question of funding and copyright also involves questions of who do we, in fact, cover in terms of copyright. Data mining, for instance, text and data mining is a sector where you have researchers saying that you must have more than 100 authorizations before you can mine into the documents, the data, and investigate. And you have to ask for each data, in fact, permission before you use the right. Is this really what a private copy or copyright has to do? Is this what it was intended for, by the way? I don't have the answer, but this is a type of discussion we could have. Again, when we try to look into the future, well, the question is always, is there a conventional way we try to follow a safeguard, or is there something new here in which we must look into to go into the world of future? And you think it's fundamentally the private copy could be the link? Let me sum things up, says Jean-Noël TRONC. Copyright is part of the solution, not part of the problem. And then it must go on evolving. Copyrights for a number of centuries have allowed us to give an economic revenue to creators. And this is still like a phantasmagoric approach of many creators. The creators should not be dependent on the state or on the king. This is not very democratic, is it? It's a good transition. Creation could come from a collective will, but in most of the cases, creator, since the Renaissance, depending from the goodwill of the prince, the king. And this for creation was very bad indeed. For the centuries have come, for the 20 years to come, our economies, in fact, will be more and more intangible economies. Intangible means value attached. Networking means sharing. And sharing value in an intangible economy is what is going to gather us, collect us all together without being on the previous elements of controversies that a copyright or private copy should be a problem. No, it is a resource, and that resource should be, of course, defended, but it's us. Question from the audience. Please speak into a mic. What about the intangible questions on the hashtag? Indeed. You know, people have reacted from what Jean-Noël TRONC said on the interest of sharing gains from fiber optics. Someone said, what about Piracy B? Could we have this again on the system? Then another person who is here in the room said, what about Adobe, the French law on copyright, Adobe? We try not to say the words, by the way. And the last would be a question on one of the last statements made. Copyright should evolve, and how? How should private copies evolve? In other terms, how should it evolve in this new digital environment? Could we take the last question? A question from the Lozère region in France. It's a good question. A lot was said, and it's a wonderful place between two broadband. 2/3 of the planet are not connected. We're discussing smartphones, but with very low broadband. And in parts of our country, production is still a luxury, or connection is a luxury. So you see, even in our country, regulation is a very efficient way to go forward. We had experience in the public domain, you and me. Between 1987 and 2002, we had to cover a number of topics. One, access to internet. This was treated by regulation. Two, unbundling, local unbundling, so that we had access from a certain number of countries. And the trade-off between broadband and tariffs is one of the most profitable today. Quantity of access wise, triple play. And that's a real challenge from the regulation. And the second topic was that of coverage of the country, which remains to be done. But before we have a real access to 2 megabyte, in the middle of nowhere, the question remains open. For Adobe, the same applies. I publicly can tell you, we heard the idea of cutting the line, remember? Which in fact is meaningless, and no court of justice would accept this. To be very clear, the problem of regulation is that between creator of cultural good and user. We've demonized the idea of creating a regulation authority, which is absurd. And by the way, I realized that in Germany, the system is much more flexible, and penalties are much heavier, by the way. And we've never seen the same public movement. So how will the digital evolve? That's the real answer. Copyright must evolve. Private copy must evolve. Part of the distribution, part of the solution, not part of the problem. And management system on private copies should facilitate or make it easy, make easy the production, distribution of cultural goods. Tomorrow will be digital. A company like SACEM says 400 agreements with digital service providers. The first with iTunes was signed in 2004, and the pan-European licenses have been on and on for years and years. It's one of the constituents of a collective management. I mean, I'm not advocating for this. It's just that we are in a world of hyper-fragmentation of right, works, usage. So collective management is a pooling of data, and it is, to me, the model which is, in fact, best suited to meet the challenge of our industry and online services. Well, after these 3 answers from Jean-Noël TRONC from the room, any question you might have for our panel? Into a mic, please. Into a mic. Is there any question? This morning we discussed something fundamental, which was the contribution of digital to the economic growth. My question is, why the contribution of digital could not be used to today's discussion? In other terms, if you're saying you can save the steel industry with the digital, could we not save culture with the digital? Is culture an industry like others? Let me reiterate, culture will save the digital, right to the very far-off place in France. I started digital. I had an Amstrad computer, British computer. My first digital assistant was a Psion, British again. Then I joined Orange in 2002, and the smartphones, one was not European, Motorola. All the others were European. French, SACEM, Alcatel, and whatnot, and others. Anyway, Philips, Siemens, Ericsson. Anyway, all this are in their cemetery in Europe. I mean, they're no longer there. Look at the startup, Price Minister, bought by Japanese, major site bought by other Asian companies. Which European digital industry can decide of the rule of the game or play in a global court, playground? Hachette, Universal, French company, Electronic Cars in the UK, number 2, I believe, video game worldwide. That's the real thing. So what can be, in fact, how to spearhead, in fact, the French companies? Well, the cultural models. And that's a question of copyright, private copy, that's all. Well, the last question, I believe, yes? It's more a reaction than a question. Denis Marion, les vœux de l'Internet. I'm inviting you here, end of January, to celebrate the new year of Internet. Piece of advertisement. An artist, and Beaumarchais will not say the opposite, an artist is someone who produces music for the audience, right? Someone who organizes concerts, someone who comes with a live show. That's an artist. And then there are technologies, registration. We had cassette, bandwidth, everything is not good. Overhead projectors, was reproducing, the tape. You had to pay your taxes each time. You had to pay your taxes on the tapes, on the cassette, taxes on the cartridge for those who had it. Anyway, we have taxes and levies on the hardware, on the software. You mentioned private copy. Of course. There are taxes on photocopiers and on printers. So what I mean to say is that we never saw one living industry that in fact is behaving so well. You have concerts everywhere with artists who are not in Las Vegas or out of the place. A good artist that in fact will get revenues thanks to SACEM is not an artist, you will say. Well, he has to leave home and go and see. And because there's a digital system now, life being digital, previous artists sometimes get less money, but they have to turn digital. They have to go to concerts. And concerts, in fact, are very profitable. Out of the concert, you buy the CD, you buy the DVD and whatnot, and it makes money for the artist. And authors say, please do not copy. So there's trust, and no one does it, you see. Any question? No question. Thank you. So real-life artists. I'd like to react myself, if you allow me, says Jean-Noël TRONC. Let's go back to real life. People who are on stage are, well, I can't say they're interpreters, I mean, that's no longer the case. But they belong to the SACEM, they're shareholder of SACEM, so they live from the SACEM. The funding model in France is this one for music. You have additional models. The living show, yes, indeed, represents roughly as much as what records represented. And copyrights distributed by SACEM to its member represent more than just the proceedings of selling CDs, who represented twice as much 10 years ago. but the total funding of the music was so limited by 1/3, that's an economic truth, that you're right in saying that the number of people who want to live from their creation has increased. So the problem is, apart from the major hits, tonight you have the major SACEM award. You have one who's been selling more than 600,000 copies, and so when they've been, they live from the SACEM. Many others who are on stage are not paid, and for some very young singers, French variety, very often they have to pay the room, they have to pay the hall where they want to sing, they have to pay for their promotion. I mean, it's very far away from where you're saying. So my message is the following. An artist on stage is an artist who is in creation, who records, registers. Apart from Jacques Brel, no one had ever heard of Amsterdam before he was on stage, all the artists have that process of recording, in fact, their record. Producing an album today, whether it's a digital sound or with Idol, just put it online. It's still costly, 50,000, 60,000 euros. It's not because the economy becomes digital that it will cost less. It's just my comment. Artists are fed up with having they have to turn digital because they even have the feeling in the French economy to be among those who are 100% digital. Thank you very much, Jean-Noël Tronc. Any reaction from the room? Someone saying no. Why did you not agree? I work with Jean-Noël Tronc. Ah, that's why. No. On stage, you have to know that there are authors, composers who are not interpreters, and whose revenues from the stage, is very, very low. The proceedings from their royalty is very, very low, and that's another fact. It's just they're not on stage. Sometimes they're just composers, authors, but they do not sing. As when they represent a value. They represent a value. Okay. I don't want this to be, Jean-Noël Tronc special. Let's have other people taking the floor. Yes, just to say that in the UK, copyrights have been arrived for artists, singers. If you're J.K. Rowling or Harry Potter, no problem for you. But the problem is for those of smaller size, less well known, for whom it's more difficult to make money, to go to the court of justice and put your case to the court of justice sometimes. But we decided to launch a digital copyright trial with a long tail in it, in other terms. And the question was as follows. Is the copyright system a good one? It's something that you said yourself. In fact, what is it that we want to do to make sure that copyrights are profitable to each and everyone? It's not a problem of money. It's not a problem of preventing artists from selling something. No. We must turn, the system around. That's my feeling, anyway. It's not an ideal system, and we'll come back on this. Digital culture is a sports. Thank you very much. Thank you for exchanging on the topic. And we have the last panel in a short while. We shall be discussing Europe. How can it develop digital attractiveness? Thank you.